good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on our third edition of the Grand Teton Music Festival music gathering. My name is Jerry Ho. I'm coming to you from Houston, Texas. Once more, it's as opposed to last week, it's a beautiful sunny day now, 72 and sunny. I'm here on the campus of Rice University in my office at the Shepherd School of Music. We're in finals week, and yes, and it's sort of strange, as with the rest of the world, very distanced, very separated. Our campus is very empty, as a lot of students have gone home, and yeah, even in finals, they're taking their finals from afar. But I wanted to talk with you today about Gustav Mahler. But before we move to the topic of Mahler, I just wanted to review with you from last week to see if you have any questions. And also, please just let us know where you're watching from. Please send us a message. If you look on your comment section, you can just type in a greeting. We'd love to hear from you. And if you have any questions about throughout this entire session, please go ahead and type them in, and I'll take pauses to go through and answer questions and say hello to all of you. And but I just wanted to thank you again for being here. So just to sort of a recap from our time from last week, we were talking about Beethoven. And Beethoven, of course, we're celebrating this in 2020, the 250th anniversary of Beethoven. So it seems like I was just thinking about how we tend to celebrate these anniversaries of composers. So Mozart had his 250th back in 2006, and sort of how the increments go. So we tend to go like the 100th anniversary, 125, 150, and then we jump to 200, and then to 250. And then if you're a living composer, if you're lucky, at age 60 or 70, you get a little shout out. And then once you hit 75, every 5 years, you get a celebration of your birthday. So 75, 80. We recently had, in 2018, we had a lot of 80th birthdays. This is sort of a bumper crop year for American music. 1938 was an amazing year. We had Joan Tower, William Bolcom, John Corigliano, and John Harbison, amongst others. But 85 and 90. When you hit 90, less and less composers celebrated. We had Boulez for a while, Dutilleux. At 100, hardly anybody. We had Elliott Carter. But so for us to hit 250th anniversary of a composer is obviously a big deal, and that's definitely a reason for celebrating. But so we were talking about Beethoven last week, and just sort of how he sort of took us from the classical era into the Romantic era. What a revolutionary he was. And we listened to parts of his first symphony, which was very much in the mode of Mozart and Haydn. And then we listened to parts of his third symphony. And that was sort of the where he shifted to sort of a much more romantic, he launched the Romantic era in a sense with that. It's a very similar case with our topic for today, Gustav Mahler. So one thing we didn't talk about with Beethoven last week was sort of the end of his career and what he did with his last works. He finished his Eighth Symphony around 1812, and he didn't write any other symphonies until around 1824 with the celebrated Ninth Symphony. And he really broke the mold with that by introducing a chorus and a chorale. And so it was very much changed the way the symphony was viewed. And we talked a little bit about Brahms and all the composers that followed Beethoven and the pressure they felt from Beethoven. And the reason I mention all of this is because our next, Gustav Mahler is known as renowned symphonist more so than anything else. I mean, his composing career, what we mainly have for his career is basically 10 symphonies, if you count his song symphony, the Song of the Earth, and parts of the 11th symphony, his quote, symphony number 10, and about 45 songs. And so there's, it's a very limited repertoire simply because, well, he had a job most of the time as a conductor. So his actually only composition time came during the summers when he was on break from the opera houses. And so just to give you a little bit of information about Mahler, Mahler was born in 1860, so we're technically celebrating his 160th birthday this year. And but every year is a good year to celebrate Mahler. And he was born in 1860 in a small town called Iglau in Moravia, so modern day Czech Republic. And basically this small town was a sort of a way station between Vienna and Prague. And so Mahler, this was a very small town atmosphere, not a huge metropolitan area. It was much more ceremonial music rather than a proper opera house, proper symphony orchestra. And so Mahler wasn't exposed to a lot of symphonic music until it was a little bit older. But this idea of Mahler as a symphonist is interesting because he sort of takes on the mantle from Beethoven. Let me just look here to see if there's any comments or something. Julie from Titonia's is listening in, watching. So hello, Julie. Thank you so much for joining us. As Beethoven sort of took us into the Romantic era, Mahler was very much taking us into the modern era. So there's a lot of parallels between these two composers. So we often divide Beethoven's life into sort of three periods: the early, middle, and late period. And it's in the different works from that time. And it's very much the same with Mahler and his output of works. There's an early period sort of covering the symphonies 1 through 4 and some of his early song cycles. His middle period covering symphonies 5, 6, and 7. And then his late period, which covers symphonies number 8, the Song of the Earth, Symphony 9, as well as the portions that he completed of the Symphony 10. And so there's and then other parallels, sort of the difficulties that both composers faced in their lives. Beethoven sort of being a social, having difficulties socially because of his problems with hearing, his loss of hearing that sort of troubled him throughout his life. And Mahler, he had faced a lot of difficulties in his various jobs as a conductor, partially for his religion. Mahler was born Jewish, and he converted to Catholicism later. This is towards the end of the 1800s. He was taking on his position in Vienna. That was sort of one of the requirements for him to become music director of the Vienna State Opera. So, but going back to the music of Mahler, I was sort of trying to prepare for this this little talk. I went back to this old young person's concert, one of Leonard Bernstein's young person's concert from 1960, and of course they were celebrating the 100th anniversary, the birth of Mahler at that time. And it was interesting to hear him talk about Mahler at that time, because he stated that basically nobody knew anything about Mahler, and he was introducing this young audience to this composer that probably no one had ever heard of, as compared to Beethoven. He used the ideas of the composers Beethoven, Ravel, and Gershwin, much more celebrated than Mahler. But he was a big believer of Mahler's music, and of course, Bernstein is one of the most celebrated Mahler conductors of our time. And so he had this young person's concert that he introduced several pieces of Mahler. And thinking now in 2020, only 60 years later, about how prevalent Mahler is on our concert programs, and how it's such a highlight, sort of just going to hear Mahler's music in a season, orchestra season. And of course, one of the highlights of the Grand Teton Music Festival is we usually perform a symphony by Gustav Mahler, because our esteemed music director, Donald Runnicles, is also one of the great Mahler conductors of our time. And in my time at the GTMF, my first year there, we had Mahler's First Symphony. And then my second year, we went to the opposite end, to his Ninth Symphony. And then we had his Third Symphony. And last year, of course, the more chamber Fourth Symphony. And so there seems to be a sort of a Mahler craze now. And of course, during Mahler's time, he did have success as a composer, but he was he felt like people did not understand his music, and he's famous. He thought that his time would come in the future, and of course, that certainly has come now, as a sort of we are sort of in the midst of a Mahler craze throughout, and so one of the highlights of the festival is always the performance of Gustav Mahler, and so. Before we go on, of course, what better way to celebrate Mahler, but just to listen to a little bit of his music. This clip is about 1.5 minutes, and it's just a little bit of Mahler Symphony 1. And just have a listen, and just so we're, have more music going on. So this is Mahler Symphony 1 with Donald Runnicles conducting. So the clip should be coming to an end, and I'm sorry if I'm interrupting. Joining us from Toronto. Thank you for joining us. And he says to check out the Toronto Mahler Society. Please do check them out. And that was just a little bit of Mahler First Symphony with our esteemed conductor, Donald Runnicles. And if I can just share with you my personal experience with Mahler. In a former life, I was a trombonist. I call myself a recovering trombonist now. I grew up in a small town, and I didn't have much exposure to classical music. And so it wasn't until I actually went to university and started studying music that a friend of mine, a bass trombonist, was, we were sitting in the library and were sitting in a small listening room, and he said, "You have to listen to this." And it was this beautiful, beautiful brass chorale. And so at this time, I was just brass crazy. Everything that had to do with brass, I was listening to, and um, it ended up being. I wanted to just share with you this little clip, and it was a clip from the Second Symphony of Mahler, and this brass chorale from the last movement. And the Second Symphony is something that is being featured as our Mahler Symphony this year at the Grand Teton Music Festival. So just have a listen to this. I just want you to, this is what hit my ear first. These were the first sounds of Gustav Mahler that I heard. Let me know what you think. If you have any comments about any of these clips. So that for me was my first introduction to Mahler, and I was absolutely blown away by this. And it was revelatory. And I'm not the only person who is been turned on to Mahler or have their lives changed by Mahler through the Second Symphony. I believe Donald Runnicles, he himself experienced a performance of Mahler 2, and a performance of Mahler 2 that sort of makes, that sort of really turned him on to being a conductor. And another famous British conductor, Simon Rattle, talked about the lightning bolt that sort of went through him when he saw this performance of Mahler 2. And so this definitely is a very special piece for a lot of people. And it was, I remember the first time I had a chance to hear this live, and it was sort of a test to the power of live music performance, something that you think that's amazing on recording. You hear this live, just the sort of the grandeur of so many people producing so much sound, and sort of how visceral. I mean, you feel literally pinned to your seat with the sound coming at you. And I remember being moved to tears by the beauty of the entire performance. And so hopefully it's something we'll have a chance to experience soon again. Hi, Matt. Yes, I love the sound there. Trish Price, from the conductor's perspective, how Maestro Runnicles' approach makes his Mahler so special. Sure. I mean, for me, this is my feeling about our dear Donald Runnicles. What makes, with Mahler, the sort of the expanse of the music is, he took Beethoven's symphonies and then he made them even longer. So we're talking about large expanses of time, and 60, 70, 80, 90 minutes. And sort of being somebody who is so steeped in opera, he is able to, and such a Wagnerian, he's able to have such great control to sort of lay the music out in a very logical architectural way. So it just feels like it's building on top of each other. So you feel like this is a big arc from beginning to end, and everything is connected. So I feel that's one reason that uh, Donald is such a wonderful Mahler conductor, and I've never seen him do Mahler 2, and I hope to see him do it soon, hopefully this summer. Um, but um, but also his the sound that he is able to get from an orchestra. He is we talked about in the first session about how every conductor is able to elicit different responses from the orchestra, and there's something magical about the sound that Maestro Venables is able to get from orchestra. It is so lush and deep and rich, and that is perfect for Mahler. And lastly, I would say once again, his experience in opera, how to work with voices, and sort of with the second symphony, you have two soloists, you have a mezzo soprano and a soprano, and just the way he's able to draw out the best from singers. And of course, there's a large chorus that finishes the symphony. So it's just sort of this, it's the meeting of all these forces that makes his Mahler very special in my mind. And of course, Mahler, though he was an opera conductor throughout his life, he was he never wrote an opera, but his symphonies contain all the elements of opera. And so, being a man of the theater, he really knows how to create the dramatic tension and the release of this tension, and that is so essential for a successful Mahler performance. But this is just my humble opinion, but that's sort of what I feel about what makes hearing Mahler at the Tetons very special. Um, Robert, thank you for joining us. Your intro to Mahler was a Utah Symphony recording, Mahler 2. Wow. Let us know who the conductor was. I'm curious if it was a Bravanel or something more recent. But back to sort of talking a little bit more about Mahler and Beethoven. Both were sort of men of the nature. So Beethoven sort of introduced us to nature in his Sixth Symphony, sort of painting a landscape, and sort of this more programmatic music that Beethoven set us on in the Romantic period. Mahler really takes us and runs full force with this, and he is very much building on what Beethoven left with sort of the idea of the symphony. In Mahler's words, encompassing the world. And so Mahler does this by increasing the size of the orchestra, creating more effects, and nature plays a huge part in his sort of early symphonies, especially Symphony 1, Symphony 1 and Symphony 3. So I just wanted to share a little bit of the first symphony here with you. And if you just listen at the opening here, you'll hear just basically these 7 octaves of A. It's just sort of stacked up. And it's sort of what I imagine to be sort of the silence that Mahler heard when he was taking these long walks through the Austrian mountains, the countryside during the summers when he was trying to compose. And you'll start hearing these various bird calls from clarinet, bass clarinet, flute, oboe, and just to hear how the sort of the various nature calls from Beethoven has influenced Mahler here. Just gives you a sort of feel of very much he's in this Beethoven realm. So Mahler was 28 years old when he wrote his first symphony, when he completed his first symphony, very similar to Beethoven. Was about 29 when he finished his first symphony. And so this trajectory of the two men are very similar, at least in the start here. Robert says that Abravanel, okay, first Mahler 2, wonderful. So we hear Mahler's, going back to Mahler now, this is the nature in Mahler's writing. And it sort of, it's here in the sort of third symphony, which is it pays homage to various aspects of nature. And I remember the powerful performance of this piece at the, was 2 years ago, in the summer of 2018 with Donald Runnicles in Jackson. And it was stunning to be able to hear this beautiful music in such a gorgeous setting. As I was saying this, I was just thinking about remembering taking this hike after my first summer there, and we had just finished the concerts of Mahler 1, and the next day I went out with one of the violinists, Ling Ling Huang, and we decided to do the hike to Lake Solitude. And so it was basically, we got up early, we went out to Lake Solitude, and then coming back, looking through the canyon as we're going back to the boat. And I was thinking about just having the sounds of the concert before, and just imagining, this is what Mahler must have been looking at while he was composing these beautiful symphonies. Just this kind of nature that puts one in touch, that he was in touch with. And so that's sort of yet another special aspect of having Mahler at the Grand Teton Music Festival. Anyway, I just wanted to share a little bit of that with you. So throughout his early symphonies, Mahler dealt a lot with nature. Another thing that tended to weigh a lot on Mahler's mind was this idea of death. So it was that sort of haunted him, and sort of his middle symphonies started to deal more with darker subjects. In Bernstein's talk, he always talked about the dichotomy of Mahler, and I think he brings out a very interesting point. He's talked about Mahler, the composer, versus Mahler, the conductor. And then he talked about Mahler the child versus Mahler the grown man, and sort of he's talking about how the first symphony sort of focused more on that. And one of the highlights of that is his fourth symphony that was performed last year. But starting with the fifth symphony, he starts really delving with darker topics. And I just want to share with a little bit of a clip with you. This is from his fifth symphony, which is probably great. So pulling you out of the storm there, I hope you can hear sort of the change of character, change of tone that is sort of imbued. This is the sort of the beginning of the middle section of Mahler's period of works. So the Fifth Symphony, and on a side note, I actually had the fortune to good fortune to conduct this beginning of this concert season back in September or beginning of October. It was my first Mahler symphony, and it was quite a thrill to just experience so much sound there in front of me. So as you notice throughout listening, just looking at these different video clips, you'll notice that the orchestra is getting bigger and bigger, and compared to what we saw with Beethoven's orchestras. So Mahler is now having 4 winds, 4 flutes, 4 clarinets, 4 oboes, 4 bassoons, much more brass, 6, 8 horns, 3, 4 trombones, and a lot of special effects to sort of get his message across. A lot of times that you'll have, in addition to all the instruments on, a lot of instruments off stage. He has 12 horns who are backstage, sort of great call. And so Mahler felt that the symphony should represent the universe, basically. It should represent all of life and embrace of all of life. And in his feeling about life, it became much, much more extreme. As we're listening to this music, you notice that the anguish, the despair, the sadness is not just everyday sadness. It's the depths of despair. It's something that we don't know if we'll get back up from. And the celebration is the happiness, the joy is absolutely it's pure ecstasy. And so he's taking us into much, much more extremes of the human condition. And I think that's sort of why we feel such a draw to Mahler is we today in May of 2020, we're feeling these extremes of emotion as we're experiencing this crisis. And but throughout this late 20th century and early 21st century, our emotional spectrum is becoming wider and wider and greater and greater. And Mahler is able to put into sound what we can't express in words. And it makes us realize that, as I mentioned last time with Beethoven, it makes us realize that we're not alone. Someone understands us. Someone has been there before, and knowing they made it through is a certain comfort. But going on about Mahler a little bit more. So the Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Symphonies sort of represent sort of a dark period for Mahler. The Sixth Symphony ends with this sort of tragic despair. There's no victory at the end of the Sixth Symphony. And in the Sixth Symphony, he has this massive hammer that he asked to be constructed for this symphony. And this hammer blows are sort of fate striking again and again. And he moves on into the Seventh Symphony, which sort of it ends with this sort of almost kitsch happiness. It takes us from night into this brightest of dawns. And so this sort of middle period, the extremes of Mahler become more and more, and sort of the emotions as that he tries to cover. Moving on from there, sort of going into his sort of final period, Mahler sort of after completing his Seventh Symphony, he had some tragedy strike his life, and several tragedies actually. So this was around 1907. The first was sort of he wrote a song cycle called Kindertotenlieder, which is songs on the death of children. And after writing this, one of his daughters died, and it being a superstitious man, Mahler felt responsible, or he felt something. He was tempting fate. Somehow he was somehow responsible for this, and it's sort of it was that, and he found out that he had a heart condition that would prove fatal to him only 4 years later. Um, and another thing that he found out was that his wife was she had gone off to she had run off to have an affair with another man, and so life was not kind to Mahler, and and at the same time his time at the State Opera in Vienna, where he had been music director for 10 years, that was coming to an end. He saw the writing on the wall. People were trying to oust him, and so he pulled up stakes, leaving Vienna, which we remember from Beethoven being there, to the capital of music. He decided to leave, and he had lots of offers. He was one of the most celebrated conductors of the time, and he pulled up stakes, and he ended up going to America. He went to New York, and first he was at the Metropolitan Opera, and he spent some time there, elevating the standards and really putting a stamp on the house as he did in Vienna. Until Arturo Toscanini came about, and then so he jumped ship and he went over to the New York Philharmonic and was conducted them as they established residency at Carnegie Hall. And so Mahler's music was very much reflective of the happenings of his life, and after this point, he knew that I think he had a feeling that his time was limited. And so we enter the sort of the late stages of his life. And so before I talk about that anymore, I just want to see if there's any questions, any comments that you might have. Please don't be shy, don't be bashful, just anything you want to ask. Thomas, Kindertotenlieder was my first experience of Mahler. I think, yeah, I remember the first time I heard Kindertotenlieder. I think some of my favorite are the Ruckertlieder. If you don't know this, have a chance. Please check them out after we finish here. One of the songs of the Ruckertlieder, I'm lost to the world. Ich bin der Welt abhanden gekommen is sort of, it's I can still remember the first time I heard this sort of longing mourning of the English horn solo. But please check out Mahler's song settings. He was a wonderful, wonderful composer for the voice. Mahler was a superstitious man, as we were saying, and he felt instead of writing a ninth symphony, because he thought that would bring about his death, as Beethoven did not move past 9 symphonies. He decided he would try to cheat death by writing a symphony but not calling it one. And it was a song symphony, Das Lied von der Erde. And it was basically a song. It was taken from Chinese poetry, and it was a celebration of life. And but it was also a acceptance of the limits of life and how finite life can be. And I just wanted to share a little clip with you. And this is, once again, Donald Runnels conducting. And a dear friend of myself, and of course of the music festival, Kelly O'Connor, singing. And this is from the last movement of the Song of the Earth. It's called Abschied, or Farewell. And here, as you're listening to this little clip, you can hear sort of the world is floating away. You can hear bits of music from the years all sort of mixed into this. And you can hear how Mahler is sort of pushing us. Now, we're talking about how Beethoven pushed us from the classical into the romantic. With this, you can really hear how Mahler is starting to push us from, he's looking back on the romantic, and he knows that we have to move forward. And he pushes us forward um, with sort of his in style and musical vocabulary. So just have a listen to this. It's a couple of minutes. This is some of the most heartbreaking music that you will find there. This is Das Lied von der Erde, last movement, Abschied. So, interrupting you from your blissful listening of the Abschied. For me, it's some of the most beautiful music that exists. But I just want to sort of bring this all together now. It's sort of, once again, talking about, we listened to a lot of music by Mahler. We talked a little bit about his life, about his dualities as a composer, a conductor, writing for symphony while not writing for the opera, but sort of why Mahler has such a hold of us now. And I think if you listen to, if you follow along on the music, it's sort of it's hearing the music live is quite the experience, the large forces that are there. So the sheer volume and mass of sound that you can get from that, able to create the most intimate settings from that. He revolutionized the symphony, taking us from Beethoven's Ninth and took us into the beginning of the 20th century. And these times of uncertainty that is reflected that is in his music, reflected all the uncertainty that was happening not only in his life but in the world at the time. Mahler died in 1911, and his music sort of was prophetic about what was to come shortly thereafter, as we had the beginning of the World War in 1914. You can hear in his music tonality, everything is starting to disintegrate. All these things that had been binding music, the forces that have been binding us together, were starting to disintegrate. And of course, we know in hindsight of the conflagration that ended up being the First World War. And so he was able to reflect and speak to the heart of the listeners to the time of his life. And it makes me think now, a little over 100 years after his death, his music still speaks to us. So if you have any thoughts, questions about Mahler, about Beethoven, anything we've talked about, Thomas, I'll send you the spelling of Rückert-Lieder and the song that I'm Lost to the World. I'll send you that. I'll send you a link to that. If you have any other questions, thoughts, please do share them. I just want to thank Mike Richards again for helping set everything up and for inviting me to be here. And I think we'll be doing this on a regular basis. Our previous episodes on conducting and on Beethoven will be available, are available, and if you're interested in looking back on them. And next week we will have Barbara Scowcroft from the Utah Symphony. She'll be joining us with her violin, and it's going to be a talk sort of more specified to violin playing. And if you're a violinist or a string player, please do tune in and catch this. Just to talk about Mahler, I hope that all of you will have a chance to hear Mahler live sometime soon. Why do I say sometime soon? Well, for multiple reasons. One, the music is amazing, and the sheer visceral experience of hearing that many people perform at once. Maybe I think that's one of the special things about hearing Mahler once again at the Grand Teton Music Festival is that the intimacy of Walk Festival Hall. It's a very small hall, and just to hear that many people playing that much in such a small space is an unbelievable experience. But also because it speaks to sort of the situation we're in right now, and which is sort of in this time of social distancing, how we're going to hear concerts in the future. And that's something that we're all grappling with, and we're hoping and praying for the best solutions that will work to allow us to go on experiencing live music, and to keep, for musicians, for us to keep performing live music. Because how do you fit 100 people and 100 people 6 feet apart? It makes it would take up a football field or something like that. And so we're trying to figure out how to perform this music. One, because we love this music, and two, because we feel like it is necessary for all of us right now. It will soothe and heal and nurture our souls in this time. And so we'll see. But until then, we have the beauty of our internet and being able to connect to each other. And I'm grateful for you joining us again this week for our talk on Mahler. And please join us again next week, same time, Wednesday at 10 o'clock with Barb Scowcroft. And until then, please listen to Mahler. I'm happy to send out some listening recommendations or anything that you might want or enjoy. And if you have any other questions or such, you can definitely feel free to message me. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. And thanks again. Well, be safe, and hope you can keep in good spirits. Thanks a lot.